Hey everybody, it's Jason Widup back again finally. It's been a long time since I've recorded one of these. By marketers for marketers. I don't know what episode number we're on, but I am super happy to be joined by my buddy and longtime colleague, Matt Cannell. I'll introduce him in a minute. First, I'll introduce the topic though. So today we're gonna chat about demand models. So like, what do you need? Models that basically help you understand where you're currently at from a demand perspective going into a upcoming quarter. Takes all the information that you have basically about conversion rates, average selling price, just all the inputs you could possibly have to help you understand and forecast what your demand needs to be to meet your company goals. And so we're just going to jump in. And actually, I learned pretty much everything I know about demand models from Matt. So he's a perfect guest for this one. So to introduce, Matt is, well, like I said, he's a buddy of mine, but he's the VP of marketing at Mobilize.io. I don't know if you call it Mobilize.io or do you just call it Mobilize?
Just Mobilize,
right? Just
yeah.
Mobilize, yeah.
Yeah.
And like I said, I've known Matt for
too long?
10
Maybe.
years now? It's about 10 years,
least.
actually. I think, yeah.
No, it's 10 years, no, 11 now.
Yeah,
10,
so
I think
quite
we
a long time.
At that program. No, maybe it was less than that. Anyway.
I think it was right around 10.
A long
it was
time.
Whenever I moved to Portland. Yeah.
Yeah, a long time. Never less.
Same agency and stayed connected over all these years. And so anyway, Matt, introduce yourself and then we'll jump in.
Yeah, Matt Cannell, VP Marketing Mobilize. Jason already said that, but been with Mobilize about a year, but been in the demand game for a long time, built a lot of these different models, some more sophisticated than others, and kind of excited to give everybody a baseline today that, hopefully can help if you're not using a demand model, or maybe some ideas about how you can further refine your model looking ahead.
Awesome. And for those of you who don't know, I recently published a blog post and released a template in Google Sheets of a demand model that you can start with. It's basically the one that I use. It's a little bit more templatized because I've got some customizations that I've made to it, but so that everybody can kind of get in and use it. I don't know. I'll put a link to, I don't know how this works. I'll put a link somewhere, in here to take you to that blog post.
Yeah, sure.
But awesome. So let's just jump right in. So let's start maybe talking a little bit about what a demand model is and maybe isn't. And then, maybe from each of our perspective. So Matt, why don't you go first?
Yeah. Well, fundamentally, we're all about revenue. Back when we used to model for like channels and leads and that kind of stuff, when marketing was, passing the MQL over, those kinds of things, it was a little bit different. But today it's all about revenue. And so demand models really ground us in the revenue and help us to understand, especially given whatever ARR or MRR or revenue goals we have, a work back model that's more realistic based on ideally historical trends if you've got the data, or you can use some benchmarks to help you understand at the revenue level how much you're going to need to generate in quarter from a demand perspective that gives you a likelihood of winning that particular percentage of business that you need to hit your targets, whether that be quarterly, annually, whatever, what have you. So that's basically it. And it's a model that ideally you can tweak and adjust as you get in market and you learn different things and you learn different dynamics of the business. And it's going to help you have a North Star, at least from a program perspective, for your demand efforts.
Yeah, and from my perspective, having grown up in marketing operations, I guess I would say, I've spent most of my career trying to make marketing a math problem. We know it's not, but the closest that, as close as I can get to a math problem, if I can predict what's going to happen, you know what I mean? We're going to do these inputs and these kinds of things are going to happen. It just makes, it relieves some of the anxiety, right? Of am I going to meet my goals? So that's one of the reasons I really like using demand model, is just because it gives you some sense that, well, although you have no control over human behavior and what people are going to do, at least it gives me some stomach comfort that either yep, we have a chance of hitting our goals with the resources that we have, plus the stuff we've either been doing and planned, or nope, whoa, we're way off. We better go back to the drawing board and figure out where we're going to get either more resources, lower the goals. And so it just gives you that, for me, it's that gut check of top down, bottoms up. You know what I mean? Where are we meeting in the middle? Are we meeting in the middle somewhere where, like I said, we just at least have a chance of meeting these goals that we've set for ourselves. And so that's why I really like
it's a great barometer for that. And I'm more of the proponent of top down when you have a revenue target to hit versus doing bottom up.
Yeah.
Which, for those that know the difference, bottoms up works from a more sales driven methodology. But it does a great job at giving you that reassurance or a go, no go decision based on what your budget looks like and your efforts and what's realistically attainable given what all of us face, whether it be, well, let's put it this way, aggressive growth targets in technology companies.
Yes. There's
several we're all familiar with
that I follow that are like, we're trying to 300% revenue this year. I'm just like, man, I thought it was hard trying to just double, and like,
I always like to take those though. You put it in the model and then you get to go ask for more money in your budget. You're like, well, look, if you want to get there, this is what it looks like.
Exactly. And so that's one of the things too. Like if you have a solid model, it's hard to argue with it, right? So like if I come to the table and I just say, and I'm like, I've got my chicken scratch, and I'm like, I'm not sure we have enough resources to meet the goals, versus if I come in with like a model that just lays out like, here's where we are, here's where you say you want to go, here's our churn, here's all of the conversion rates that we know because we've been measuring them, and we're still $100,000 off. It's hard to argue at that point. We can argue about it, but we're arguing facts at that point, which is kind of, it's a grounding. It gets everybody on the same, I guess, working from the same hymnal, whatever, however you say that, singing from the same hymnal.
Sing it, all in key.
Working from it, yeah. So that's how I use it. And I think one of the reasons why I just figured everybody did these. So like when I came into this role, when Matt and I were working together first here at Metadata, Matt built one. He's like, we need a demand model. I'm like, what do you mean? He's like, yes, we need a demand model. And sir, and I've had him, of course, at these larger companies I've worked at. But we didn't have one here. We were just kind of like flying by the seat of our pants a little bit. And that gave us our first, and a lot of our input, I'm sure you remember this, a lot of our input data was really horrible. We had no historical real data. It was Logan, basically, hey, Logan essentially just memorizing all the stages in his mind.
But also having a pretty good gut on it. I mean, just given where we're at, which was good. And some of you, you may only have that, and that could be your best asset, at least having a hypothesis and a line in the sand.
Yes.
Build a model
based on start.
Totally.
Keep going. Yep. And so, but a lot of our customers don't, what I realized, I started working with some of our customers, and I would just kind of ask them about like, so, hey, what's your conversion rate here? And I don't know. What's your ASP? I'm not sure. And so I was like, okay. So people need help. And so that's really why I started to kind of talk about this a little bit more and wrote a blog, and then took mine and templatized it so that other people could use it. It was like, well, give people at least a starting point. I know a lot of our customers are probably going to at least start from this point. So I think what I'll do is I'll share this document we're talking about just to give everybody like, well, what could it look like? Now there's no real standard for a demand model as far as I know.
And in fact, most of them are going to be somewhat of a snowflake because the business models are so different. And of course your data and the inputs, the products, all these different things, which we'll get into in a minute. But this is a good baseline for sure.
It is. And you can even start with less data than this. And so I'll actually, as we walk through it, I'll give hints of like, oh, I didn't start with this data, I have this now. Also, Matt and I are going to pick apart this model a little bit too, because this is like Matt said, it's a fairly basic model. But if you're fairly new, starting out, if you don't have really long sales cycles, and if you know some of your data pretty well, this is a good place to start, I think. And so I'll start at the top, and then we'll just kind of work our way down, and we'll get into some areas a little bit more than others. The first section is really just understanding where we need to get to. And so we start and this is set up to be able to measure really any period, but we'll just talk about it as quarters because that's what most of us are managing to quarters. So where am I starting the quarter at? And all this is all dummy data, by the way. where am I starting the quarter? So I ended last quarter basically at $11 million. Or if I'm in that last quarter and I'm trying to forecast for the next quarter, I can just predict where am I supposed to end this quarter at? And then where do we want to end the next quarter at? So that's going to give me the difference between those is just the basic growth delta. So that's how much do we need to grow in ARR between those two time periods. But that's not all. You don't have to just go out and generate $4 million of business all of a sudden. You've got some other debits and credits potentially. So one of the things is you've got churn. So if you've been in business longer than a year, you've got customers that are coming up for renewal in that quarter. And hopefully all of them are going to renew, but that's probably not going to happen, right? So what you want to do, and we'll talk about this for a second. You want to really understand where you're going to be at from a net revenue retention, NRR perspective. So we're dealing with revenue in this whole model because that's what every good marketer should be held and managing to revenue goals. So we're at a revenue level here. And we're talking about net retention rate. And so the way to think about this is I actually plug in the amount of dollars that are at stake in that quarter, actual renewal dollars. And I don't take an average across quarters because most SaaS businesses, they sell really a lot in Qs 2 and 4, and Qs 1 and 3 usually are less, there's seasonality in there. And so if I just straight lined it for the whole year, on quarters 1 and 3, I would overestimate, and then 2 and 4, I would underestimate the amount of churn, and that would maybe throw my model off. So in here, now the best case scenario is you have negative churn, which means you're adding money to the—
You're expanding. Yeah, it's the expansion rate.
Yep. But a lot of us aren't. And so if this is a positive number, it actually is going to reduce the amount of revenue you need to drive. But if it's not, if you're only going to renew 90% of your revenue, you can see it's going to add money to what you actually need to drive. So this was 4 million. Now it's 4.2 because you're saying, well, 90% of my revenue in that quarter is going to churn. Matt, what do you think about this?
Yeah, no, spot on. And sometimes I've seen with models where the expansion business is treated totally separate, and it's almost Bluebird, and it doesn't fall into, I shouldn't say Bluebird, but it doesn't fall into the demand targets from the demand generation side of the camp. So a lot of folks may not need this. It just depends on how you measure the business and what is success. ARR, for the sake of ARR, is definitely the most important, but some break it out as growth, some break it out as new business, and a lot of folks will operate like I operate in a new business mindset from a demand perspective, but I look at everything. We break it out. We break out growth and expansion as separate. We break out even partner revenue as separate. And so the models that we work off of don't necessarily, from a demand perspective, for demand marketing budget and demand programs, don't take those things into account.
Right.
That makes total sense. So, but this is really great because, I mean, for those that it's all up, and we need to understand, well, how does growth factor into it, or how does churn factor into it? You do have to look at those things. This is good for making sure this is accounted for.
Now, one thing
like when your net retentions. What's that?
Oh no, I was going to say so this could cause some contention in a business, and here's why. And this is a real world example. So let's say it's just 100%, right? You never really have to worry about it. It's always just, you're always replacing the revenue, so you're not really having to think about replacing it or actually having it as a credit to your pipeline. Well, let's say all of a sudden, the CS team comes in and is like, well, shoot, man, this is going to be a tough quarter. We're only going to have to do 85%. Well, if you bake this into your demand model, you're essentially saying, okay, great, sales and marketing, like we can't quite, we couldn't quite save our customers.
Yeah, you gave it a news.
So you have to go make up for it. You know what I mean? It's kind of shifting responsibility away from like CS and making customers happy and getting them to renew back over to marketing and sales. And that is not a super fun conversation to have, especially when you're riding the number of heads you have in sales is literally just enough to make the new business target, and they don't have buffer to sell more. It just in terms of their time. And so this was something that, I actually had to realize. I was like, oh yeah, if it's not 100%, which luckily ours is getting close to that now.
It forces the hand to be accountable in the different disciplines. Even if you, if you know that you're going to experience churn, and you need your CSM team to look at growth, but also I do think you have to, from a new business perspective, still factor in some level of churn, just so that you're still accounting for that, even though
A little buffer.
a little buffer, exactly. Because whether that, it depends on where the programs fall. If the programs, marketing is marketing. As the head of marketing, your job is to support, obviously customer expansion, and there's programs around that and advocacy and things like that, as well as new business growth. And there's a blend. So I do factor in some level of churn in my new model, but then growth is purely CSM or customer marketing, and then partner marketing or partner demand is another chunk of that revenue data. And actually, this was the first quarter that we actually rolled out explicit targets for partner demand.
Oh, nice.
In our business,
yeah.
Which is good. So.
Yeah, I'm going to have to ask for your help, I'm sure, in like 6 months. Like, Matt, we've gotten too complicated. I need your help on the demand model.
Simplify.
This is going to quickly.
It may not be too complicated. Hard to say. You can overcomplicate these things. I would say
that's true.
Whatever's going to give you the most confidence to at least, and hopefully most folks have some level of historical data where you can go in and you can look at a few things and be able to build your model with some confidence of where you've been. Or if you're using a smart platform like Insight Squared or something that gives you some of that analysis, it's always helpful. So,
yeah. And so, on this one, I would say,
this is great. Like,
you start with this, you start by just assuming you're going to replace, what I mean? You're going to have renewal rates at about 100%. But so what I do is I basically take what our forecast is and I subtract 10%, just again, so I'm a little bit more conservative. So if we're saying, hey, we're going to have 100% net retention rate, I just plan for 90. And so far that's worked out fairly well. Cool. So the next step is, so now we understand, like, what's the quarter ARR goal? Oh, I spelled quarter wrong. There we go. What's our quarter?
Without the autocorrect. The gift and the curse.
Quarter ARR goal. So this is basically just your growth delta plus your net churn. All right, great. So now I know it's not 4 million, it's 4.2 million that we need to make up. So guess what? Hopefully we got a lot of pipeline waiting to be closed. And it's, again, I don't have to source.
You did an amazing job last quarter.
Yep, exactly. Or your salespeople are really horrible about forecasting when something's going to close. Either one is okay. You're still going to get some pipeline.
You might be ruffling some feathers.
Exactly. Luckily, we have hey, Mike, hey, KY, hey, guys, hey, Danny.
Hey, our team is awesome at it. So I'm with you.
What I don't have in here, which we talked about a little bit earlier, Matt, is because this is looking at, so I'm looking at next quarter pipeline down here. But one of the things in the middle of this could be current quarter pipeline that is estimated to push, or that's likely to push to next quarter. That's a hard number to get to. That's why I didn't include it in this template. Like Matt mentioned, we have Insight Squared, which actually gives us, it looks back at historical and every quarter and what percent pushed when you were at this part of the month, and so it gives you an estimate that I just plug in for now. I don't do a bunch of math on it. I just plug in what Insight Squared says is going to push, and then I use that as a decrement to my total amount that I need to drive. But this is really looking at, well, what's the existing pipeline that is already says is going to close in the next quarter, in that time period you're measuring or you're trying to forecast for. And we have 6 stages of pipeline at Metadata. Everybody has different numbers of stages. And so for this model, I just put early stage versus late stage, because what we're really trying to do is understand the amount of dollars in there, and then like a weighted amount. So what's the percent likelihood that pipeline is going to close? And ideally, it's what percent of that pipeline is going to close by that time period. So it's not like a certain percent of that pipeline is going to close, but it might be a year from now. Well, that's not really helpful for us. So we really want to know, like, what's the chances of stage 2 pipeline closing between now and the end of this time period that I'm measuring? And so for this model, we've got $5 million in early stage that closes at a 20% rate. So that's going to give me $1 million. And then I've got 1.25 that closes at 80%. That's going to give me another $1 million. As you can tell, I did it for nice, easy math purposes. So I'm basically saying I have 6.25 in pipeline, but based on weights and likelihood to close, I'm going to say I'll close $2 million of that between now and the end of the next quarter.
Mm-hmm. And this is a weighted win rate on revenue is basically what you're doing.
Yes.
And I've seen models where, you know, you don't factor in the stage or the probability or any of that weighting. And sometimes you're just looking at the win rate on revenue based on historical, which simplifies it.
Right.
But a lot of times you've got different licensing models or different products and different complexities of the products you sell, whether that be large enterprise versus SMB and those kinds of things. And as you think about it, in addition to some of this weighting, you know, we're really talking about qualified pipeline versus unqualified pipeline.
Right. Yep.
As well as you can introduce different business models. In this case, licensing types. What I'll use as an example. If you have an SMB license or you have an enterprise license, those deals in terms of the win rates typically could be different and very different. In fact, SMBs can close, you know, 60 to 80%. Very consistently, where enterprise you're getting more into the averages of 25 to 30%. And so then you can factor it into this kind of a model as well. I like what you're doing with stages though. If you have that level of granularity, you can understand, you know, what percentage of, you know, deals in early stage or unqualified, let's put it that way, versus late stage or qualified.
Yep.
To give yourself even more confidence. That's an even better, more salient model. And you want to look at that historically for each of the quarters, because like, you know, Jason said, you've got seasonality. We know what we're dealing with. What's the likelihood for those to push? Because that'll just make this even much more strong. So.
Yep. Yeah, there's so many other ways you could break that down too. And that's kind of what I've realized as when I started to use this, I probably had like 12 lines of data in here that I was starting with. And now mine's even more complicated than this. I probably have 50 lines of data that I'm working with. And so for me, it's like every quarter I've learned something. I've either curated or have come into a new data set, you know what I mean? And then I add that to it. And then now I'm getting even more accurate and more accurate. They're still always off, but like, you know, it's getting a little closer.
Yeah, they get better over time. And if you have historical data, it can get even better. One of the things that you want to think about when you think about win rate on revenue as a whole, whether you're looking at stages or not, or qualified or unqualified, it's going to give you a factor, a mathematical factor for understanding what the coverage needs to be.
Yep.
So for example, every quarter, you know, we're not like for our business, we have roughly 15% or 20% that closes in is created and closes in quarter, which is called bluebirds, basically, which are nice to have. We like those. It's a bit serendipitous when you have a longer sales cycle. Some people rely heavily, you know, everything closes in quarter or it's monthly or whatever, what have you. But the one thing that we're doing from a demand perspective is we're always building quarter for the next, building demand for the next quarters out.
Yeah.
And by the end of the quarter, like one of our OKRs is, you know, what's the coverage look like for the next quarter? And that's what we're shooting for. So that drives ultimately our programs and what we're trying to do. And this demand model becomes essential to understand, okay, well, let's look at historical win rate on revenue based on our different product types. And then I know where we need to be coverage wise, and I can give a barometer to the business as we head into the quarter, knowing that we got 20% roughly for bluebirds. If we're not at that 80% coverage, we could have a problem.
So when you're looking at coverage,
that's open pipeline. Yeah.
Okay. So you're basing it on current open pipeline for that quarter.
Yeah. Predicted
any
close
stage, like any stage?
No, I look at both. I look at a lot of stuff that's, you know, doesn't really get addressed almost immediately for the next quarter. So a lot of it will still be in that stage one, but I do look at percentage based on what you're doing, like what's qualified.
Yeah.
And that's really important because that'll give you an even better benchmark for the health of it. And that's where you really want to work with sales leadership though, too, and make sure that folks, you know, have some level of confidence for what they're putting in and, you know, doing it, you know, a continuous scrub of the pipeline to make sure that the stages are accurate and the level of qualification is there, so that's not inflated. But yeah.
Are you able to walk that back? So like, you know the coverage from an opportunity standpoint, but obviously you need leads to get to those opportunities, right? So are you able to then take that back on
Yeah.
even like a lead coverage? Like, and then, but what about the time frame for that? So do you have to understand like, well, how long does it take for a lead to turn into an opportunity? So you know
I do measure
where
that.
you need to, yeah.
Yep. Yep. A lot of times, and it depends. I mean, we do factor in lead conversion timeframes, but fundamentally, I mean, the only leads I care about are hand raisers,
Right.
folks
Right.
that have a real intent to buy and they've expressed it. So those are inbounds more often than not, or an outbound that's highly qualified from sales, bringing it in the door. And then we could look at that, and that's actually how I build it back. And some of that we can rely on we can break it out even further from a channel perspective, because we know when we get various inbounds. But yeah, you're able to break it down based on that. But you're doing it based on, and this is where ASP comes into factor. So which we haven't talked about yet. We're going to get down there, but ASP is where you break out that based on, let's say you have different product lines and different sales cycles even, but that'll help give you like, all right, well, what's my ASP? How many opportunities? Then you can break it out in number of, individuals, but really you can go even a step further, and it's a number of companies. So there's a lot of ways you can, slice it down, but let's keep going.
Nice.
Cool. I know we'll cover some of this.
Yeah. Awesome. All right. So we just figured out our open pipeline and what we think is going to close from that. So now when we add all this together, what we need in terms of, revenue to hit the quarter goal minus the pipeline. Now this is our total ARR to close, $2.2 million. All right. So now we know what we're dealing with. Now, hopefully marketing is not fully responsible for all of that demand. Our sales is doing some outbounding, but if it is, you can certainly change this in the model, like this, but we'll go with 75% marketing, 25% sales. And this is really just to break out these numbers down here so that sales knows what they're responsible for and marketing knows what they're responsible for.
Yep, that's a work back. Yep.
So the first thing though is now we're going to turn revenue into number of deals, right? So the way to do that is through your average selling price. So I know how much revenue I need for every customer we bring in the door. We sell, this isn't us, but like we sell an average of $50,000 in ARR. And this is where Matt was talking about, if you have different product lines or even different segments of customers that spend way more or way less, you could break this out in a lot of different ways. Like here's the average ARR for enterprise on this product. And then you'd have rates related to that, you know what I mean? And then mid-market, this kind of product, and you'd have ASP for that. And so you could break that out and make it even more accurate. Lucky for us, I have one product to sell. Well, we have a separate product, but we don't even count it. And so, so for all intents and purposes, one product. I guess maybe I should bake in that other stuff so that I have a little bit extra revenue, but it's so small. But then I just use the one ASP.
You may want to.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, I need to take a look at that. But
yeah.
So we'll just call it $50,000. And so then it's a simple division problem. How many times does $50,000 go into 2.2 million? 44 times. So now this is the number of logos we need to close, basically, source and close. And then just using the percent breakout to say, well, what has to come from marketing, what comes from sales. So now the other inputs you need is, well, what's my conversion rate from late stage to close one deal and from early stage to a close one deal? So I can work myself back to know, well, how many late stage opportunities do I need and how many need to come from sales and marketing? And then here's my early stage to late stage opportunity conversion rate. And then how many early stage opportunities do I need? And broken out by marketing and sales. So this is really just basic math right here, starting from your ASP, but could get incredibly more complicated than this to be more accurate.
Yeah, and you've got to really, I mean, when you think about it, now you're doing win rate on count, which that's another flavor of it. And you should look at both. We should do win rate on revenue and win rate.
Oh, so like instead of turning it into a deal, like actually revenue this back with the conversion rates all the way back. I haven't tried that yet. Yeah.
Well, I always like to look at win rate on revenue over count, because the more complex product you have, or the number of products you have, licenses, things like that, introduces complexity that isn't really satisfied by the count. The revenue can give you that, and you can get a little bit better confidence rate in terms of the win rate and what's realistic, especially if they fluctuate. But that's what you're doing here. So you've got a 19%, which is ultra conservative, I think, or this is more actually, we're selling an enterprise product, which had 50,000. Yeah, I think I'd say we were there.
Yeah. This should be closer to probably 80%, honestly, right?
Right. Late stage would be at 80.
To close, yeah.
Yeah, and then early stage to late stage. But really, you're just talking about qualified. What I look at is I'll look at win rate, because I like what you did here. You did early stage to late stage opportunity conversion. What you could do is opportunity create to qualified. That's another way of thinking about it.
Yeah.
And what you consider to be qualified. Some say stage 2, some say stage 4, or whatever your stages look like. And that becomes really important because, you know, generating a number of opportunities for the sake of opportunities is one thing, but you really want to really understand, like, what's the likelihood of these to be qualified, and then start drilling into those, especially as you're selling different product types, to understand, well, first off, the source and the audience, and as you look back and you evaluate your performance to say, are we really generating anything qualified for these more complex products versus simplified, those kinds of things. A lot of things to take into account. I don't want to confuse it, but this is really good just to do a work back to say, well, what's the number I'm going to need for that quarter, and then break it out between, marketing and sales. But it's all one team, one dream, but we have to
well, and I
programs
do it because
are vastly different. The enablement, the programs, the technologies we use. But it can also help you understand, well, what's the level of investment we're going to need. So when you sit down with sales leadership and you say, generating 108 opportunities in a quarter, depending on the size of the team and what they have, it could be a pretty daunting task, given that they're busy working deals right now. So you can start to make very concerted decisions about how marketing can help that and all those kinds of things.
That's actually exactly what we did. This fostered a conversation with me and, our head of sales. And the conversation just turned into, well, what do you expect your reps to bring in from outbound? You know what I mean? Instead of me telling you, like, what do you think they can bring in? And he was just like, did quick math. He's like, oh, let's see, 4 meetings a week. I can't remember what it was, but times this number of reps, okay, boom. And I, for ease sake, I just plugged that number into my models. Like, okay, that's what you expect your sellers to bring in on top of all the inbound we're bringing in. Great. I'll just plug that in and I'll just use it to decrement the number that I need to bring in. Because so far, this isn't most cases, but I've been bringing in, I'd say probably 90%, 90+% of the demand at Metadata through marketing. Just because we're decent. We're the king of conversation ads.
I like what you guys are doing. I really do.
Thanks.
No, but I seriously mean that. I do like what you guys are doing. And I follow along closely. It's nice.
But that's the way you can do it, is you could, like, instead of just putting a percent in here, you could do the bottoms up, which is what I did, is to just say, okay, hey, sales leader, what do you expect your team to bring in? Make sure it's reasonable so that you don't feel like you're carrying the whole weight. But then bake that in.
They got to hold it. You measure it. What gets measured gets managed. And you can hold accountability. There's other ways you can do it. I mean, you can take these, and as you get more historical data, and you can understand, your quarterly performance, based on seasonality or just any specific business trends, you can break your assumptions out to factor in, at the quarterly level, each quarter, what you expect the breakout to be and your programs, but also inherently outbound in summertime is pretty rough.
And honestly, in our situation, these rates would not be nearly the same between an outbound and inbound. So outbound for us right now is primarily to, like, companies and people that they've had relationships with before, because all these sellers come from G2. And so their rates are probably much higher than these, you know what I mean? So it's like, if I really wanted to be more accurate, and that's why they don't have to do 108, like, well, this isn't my real data, but like, if this were in my case, they wouldn't be responsible for that whole 108, because they actually convert at a higher rate through these different, these different stages. And so they don't need as many at the top of the funnel. But
that's where you can go even further, and you could say, okay, well, your aggregate targets, but then as you break it out based on different types of selling programs, like relationship selling, and that sometimes you may not, the numbers can change based on very simple marketing programs that you run to hit the goal, which is kind of interesting as you take it a step further. Because a lot of folks will say, okay, this is how many opportunities we need to create. Now let's break it out by a channel and a programmatic perspective.
Right.
and then investment on that end, and say, okay, what are we going to throw at it, and what can we do? People see, paid versus organic versus, outbound versus inbound, and you go the next level down. And this is where you can do that, because you know how many opportunities, and then you got to start thinking about, lead to op conversions and all that, and you can build that into your model as another portion of
There we
that.
go. Yeah. I got that.
Oh,
baked
you were,
in, yeah.
sorry. There you go. That's your.
And this is, this is going to be different for everybody. So like Matt and I consider these to be hand raisers, not a lead that's like a content conversion or something like that, I think. So for me, and I think for Matt too, in our models, I'm really mostly basing it off of people ask, like demo requests, not, and we don't gate content, so we don't really have a notion of a lead, but for some, your rate might be way lower because you're just capturing a bunch of content leads, and putting them into a nurture series, or maybe not. And so your rate might be 10%, lead to opportunity rate. So whatever it is, you just need to know what your motion is and what that rate is and what you're counting. Are you counting just demo request hand raisers? Are you counting every single email address that you get? Or break it out differently. You got one path for content leads and you got another path for hand raisers, and they each have different conversion rates.
Yeah, and those conversion rates will be very, very different, but depending on the level of intent.
And then the last thing I have in this model is something to help with the sales cycle problem. So obviously, if your sales cycle is 60 days, I mean, you're pretty much just, you're in a quarter, you know what I mean? You're kind of in the quarter, you're planning in a quarter, you're closing in a quarter. This is a lot easier. If your sales cycle is 6 months, then this is a lot harder. And so what I did here, and this is the most simple way you could do this, is what's the percent likelihood that a lead coming in today will close within a certain time period? So for me, if I'm using this model, and let's say I'm on a normal quarterly schedule and it's March 1st and I'm planning for the next quarter that starts April 1st. Well, then I've got 120 days in there, because I've got from today, if I'm really trying to figure out for next quarter, from today forward, what percent chance, what's the likelihood of a lead converting to a closed won deal in 120 days? And then you'd plug that in, and then that would essentially just serve to increment the number of inbound leads you need to make sure that you've got enough so that that certain percent will close in that Matt called it bluebird time, where they're going to kind of source and close in that same period. So for example, if this were only 70% close within that period, it means I'm going to have to bring 812 demo requests in, versus if 100% of them do, it means I need 569. So it really is there to buffer what you're doing, knowing that just to kind of handle the sales cycle problem. There's a lot of other ways to handle it. And in fact, I need to get more sophisticated, in fact, in mine. Matt, what are some of the, like, how do you handle sales cycle time?
Yeah, it really depends. I mean, like I said, you look at each of the products and the sales dynamics, and you break it out by days. But what I try to do is I'll factor in a time period, and I'll actually look at quarters ahead. So I'll break it down to say, okay, I work with our, finance folks and understand what are the top line targets for new business, for example, and then break that out quarter over quarter as we know it. And then I get my targets in quarter. But if I know I've got a 6-month sales cycle, I can weight that to say, well, 70% of my Q1 goal for demand creation is going to come from, Q2 targets or even Q3 targets. And that becomes my goal for my demand created in Q1, knowing that I'm building it for Q3 close. So when you think about Bluebird, it depends on the period. Like, for some folks, like a quarter, you live and die on the quarter. There's no Bluebird period. You're very intentional. But let's say, for example, you get a deal that comes in, the last 2 weeks of the quarter and closes, that would be a Bluebird period. But for me, like, if we're focused on enterprise level deals, we know that's a 6-month at least minimum in some cases, depending on the complexity of the product and the sell itself. Like, anything that comes in quarter and closes is Bluebird, and you factor some of that in. But basically I look at, you got to start with your top line targets the quarters ahead, because you're building demand. If you've got a 6-month sales cycle, you're building demand in this quarter for the quarters to come, and having those targets will help you be able to set the target for what you're doing in the quarter, knowing that if you have enterprise and that sales cycle is much longer, that's going to be a little bit different versus a mid-market or an SMB that closes in quarter. That's why you want to have those factored into your model so you know what you're up against.
Right. Yeah, and that's really, I mean, that's those are the inputs really. And like we've been talking about, there's so many ways you can, and each one of these should be fairly unique to your business. Like I couldn't just pick this one up, drop it into another business and have it work, so there's some uniqueness that has to be baked into these models for, each business, just depending on what you're selling, what your sales cycles are, how you sell, how you market, all those things will add differences to it. But I think there's some bare minimum things you need to get it started. I think you need to know where you're starting from, right? Where you're going. Ideally, you understand churn fairly well. You have a decent handle on pipeline. And you have at least a general sense of your unit economics from a marketing perspective of what it's going to take you to get to opportunities. And I think if you have that stuff, then that's the basics that you need to get started.
Yeah, do some basic win rate analysis, do a win rate on revenue. That's the best way and the easiest way to do that for all you Salesforce users. But in general, look at everything that's closed and what percentage of those ended up as won, and then do that on a quarterly or even monthly, depending on your business model. And you can start to aggregate or trend for time periods, but you can also do an all up rate, those kinds of things. If you've got that, that will set you up fairly well for the kind of coverage you need, and then break that out by the product type. That's really important, especially if you have complex products that you sell versus smaller that are more transactional. You definitely want to split that out because the programs and of course the dynamics involved in predicting that demand are going to be very, very different. But
right. Nice.
Cool.
All right. Well, that was easy. It's been like, I don't know, 4 months since I've done one of these episodes. So Matt, thanks for joining me for another episode of By Marketers for Marketers. Hopefully everybody found this useful. Come back often. We'll be doing these more frequently. And hopefully you'll learn some stuff just like I did today. Matt, thanks again
throw any
for
questions
coming on.
You betcha. I really appreciate it.
Buddy. Yep. Yeah. Thank you.